She is nothing, the Duke whispered, his voice sharp enough to cut through the whispers of the ballroom. Isabella Harrington stood frozen, her heart sinking as the Duke's words echoed in her mind. She was nothing. The room swirled around her, the laughter and chatter of the aristocracy fading into a muffled hum. Duke William Ashford, the most powerful man in the room, had just rejected every lady of noble birth in favor of her sister, Margaret. His cold eyes swept over the crowd, taking in every detail, every polished face, every hopeful glance. His gaze barely lingered on Isabella, but then, just then, he paused. Time seemed to freeze. His eyes, sharp and calculating, landed on her. She could feel it, the shift in the air, as if the entire ballroom held its breath. She could hardly breathe. He wasn't looking at Margaret anymore. He was looking at her. The room around them seemed to collapse into silence. No one dared to move, to speak. The energy in the air crackled, electric. The Duke's figure was the epitome of power, every inch of him demanding attention, his sharp jawline set, his cold gray eyes never leaving hers. Isabella's body tensed, her heart hammering in her chest. "You," he said, his voice low, controlled, but unmistakably commanding. "You are the one I choose." She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The words felt like a punch to her gut. She had never been chosen before. She had always been the invisible one, the one no one noticed, the one shoved into the corner of every grand event. But here he was, standing before her, his hand outstretched, and she was no longer invisible. The Duke's hand hovered in the air for a moment, like a force pulling her out of the darkness and into the light. Isabella's fingers trembled as she reached for him, her movements slow, unsure. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, louder than the music, louder than the whispers of the room. The moment stretched, the air thick with tension. As her fingers brushed his, it was as if the entire world had shifted. Her world, her entire existence, had changed in a single moment. She was no longer a shadow in the corner. She was the one he had chosen. The crowd gasped, the silence shattered by the sound of footsteps as everyone in the room turned their attention to the Duke and the woman he had chosen. His grip on her hand was firm, his touch steady, as if he had been waiting for this moment all along. Isabella's knees felt weak. She could feel the heat of his touch spreading through her, but the coldness in his eyes never wavered. She had always known that the Duke was a man of immense power, but now, standing before him, she could feel it, the weight of his gaze, the weight of his expectations. Every eye in the room was on her, and yet she had never felt more exposed. She had always been the one overlooked, the one rejected. But now, Duke Ashford had chosen her. The room's energy had shifted. The powerful, self-assured Duke had broken the unspoken rules of the elite, choosing someone from the shadows, someone who had no right to be in the spotlight. But there she was. His gaze remained fixed on her, his expression unreadable. Her mind raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. How could this be real? How could he choose her, the woman who had spent her entire life in the shadows of others? She tried to steady her breath, to steady herself. But the truth was, she was trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming shock. The Duke didn't say another word. His hand tightened around hers, pulling her gently toward him. His strength was undeniable, but there was something more to it, a certainty, a command that couldn't be ignored. She had been chosen. There was no turning back now. As the Duke led her through the ballroom, Isabella's mind raced. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the shock, the envy, the disbelief. But in that moment, all she could focus on was him, the Duke, the man who had looked right past every woman in the room and chosen her. His presence, so commanding, so overpowering, made it impossible for her to think of anything else. She had been invisible her whole life, but now, she was seen. And in the silence that followed, in the space between the gasps of the crowd, Isabella realized that her life had just begun. The Duke had chosen her, and she was no longer nothing. She was the one. The Duke's grip on Isabella's hand remained firm as he guided her through the ballroom. The weight of his touch was undeniable, but there was something more to it, something that unsettled her. As they moved through the sea of whispers and shocked gazes, Isabella's heart raced, her breath shallow. She had never been in a situation like this before. Her world turned upside down in an instant. The room was alive with hushed conversations, but she could barely hear anything above the pounding of her own pulse. Duke William Ashford, the man who had rejected every noblewoman in this room, had chosen her. She was no longer a shadow in the corner. He had seen her, and now everyone else would too. His eyes, cold and calculating, remained locked on her as they passed the other guests. The looks of astonishment and envy followed them, but the Duke paid no attention. He was used to being the center of attention, used to commanding a room with nothing more than his presence. But Isabella, she was not. She had never been at the center of anything before. Her life had always been a quiet one, a life spent on the fringes, never meant to be noticed. But now, with Duke Ashford leading her across the ballroom, her existence had changed forever. His hand never wavered as he led her to the center of the room, to a place she had never dared to imagine. The crowd parted around them, as if his very presence demanded it. Duke Ashford stopped in front of the large, opulent mirror that stood at the far end of the ballroom. His reflection was a perfect mirror image of power and grace. Isabella stood beside him, feeling small, her heart fluttering in her chest. She barely recognized herself in the polished surface, as if she was someone else entirely, someone important, someone worth noticing. But it felt foreign. Her body was tense, her mind swirling with confusion. He had chosen her. The realization still hadn't fully settled in. She looked up at him, but his expression was unreadable, his face the same stoic mask he always wore. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't quite place. The silence between them stretched, suffocating. And then, Duke Ashford spoke. His voice was calm, low, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. "You belong here," he said. His words, simple as they were, felt like a command. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever made her feel as if she truly belonged. "Here," she whispered, barely able to form the words. He turned to face her, his grip on her hand tightening slightly. "Yes," he said, his voice unwavering. "You belong with me." The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Isabella's head spun, the weight of his declaration pressing down on her. How could this be real? How could he, the Duke, the man who had everything, the man who could have any woman in this room, choose her? She was nothing like the women who were usually in his orbit. She was plain, ordinary even, with no wealth or family standing to speak of. And yet, here she was, standing beside him, the center of his attention. The room was still, too still. It was as if the very air had thickened, waiting for her response. The tension was almost unbearable. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, watching, waiting. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to speak. All she could do was look up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. Duke Ashford's eyes softened, just slightly, as if he could see the confusion and uncertainty written across her face. He stepped closer to her, his presence overwhelming, and for a moment, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just him and her, the chaos of the ballroom fading into nothingness. His hand moved to her chin, tilting her head up so that she had no choice but to meet his gaze. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes flicking over her face with a calculated intensity. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Do not doubt yourself, Isabella. You were always meant for this." His words sent a shiver down her spine. She had no idea how to respond. She had no idea what she was supposed to do now. But in that moment, one thing was clear. Her life would never be the same. The Duke had chosen her. And with that choice, everything had changed. Isabella's world, once small and contained, had just expanded in ways she could never have imagined. But with that new world came a weight, a pressure she wasn't sure she could bear. The eyes of the room were still upon her, the whispers still buzzing in her ears. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer a shadow. She was a part of something much bigger. And Duke Ashford, for better or worse, had chosen her to stand beside him. As they stood there, in the center of the ballroom, everything seemed to stop. The room, the people, the noise, it all faded away, leaving only the two of them. The Duke's hand still held hers, firm and steady, but now it felt different. It was no longer just a gesture of power, but a promise, one that Isabella wasn't sure she was ready for. The weight of that promise was both thrilling and terrifying. And yet, as she stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, she knew that she couldn't turn back. She had been chosen, and now she would have to find her place in this new world, a world where nothing would ever be the same again. Isabella's pulse quickened as Duke Ashford led her further into the ballroom, the weight of his hand on hers a constant reminder of the shift in her world. The room buzzed around them, but to her, it was as if everything had gone silent except for the pounding of her heart. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, the weight of their gazes pressing down like an unspoken judgment. The Duke moved with grace and confidence, his presence commanding the space as if he owned it. His cold gaze never left her, and she was acutely aware of the power he held over her, over everything in this room. Every step she took beside him seemed to echo in her mind, reminding her that she was no longer invisible. She had been seen. The Duke paused, and Isabella, following his lead, halted as well. They stood at the edge of the dance floor, the marble beneath their feet cold and unyielding. A soft murmur spread through the crowd as the Duke turned to her, his hand still holding hers, but now with more purpose. He stepped closer, his body a mere breath away from hers. The heat of his presence was overwhelming, and she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vulnerability. Isabella. The Duke's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried through the room like a command. She looked up at him, her throat tightening. "Do not look away from me." His words were clear, but the tone in which he said them made her shiver. It was a command, not a suggestion. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. No one had ever demanded her attention in such a way. The Duke's hand moved from hers to gently rest on her lower back, his fingers pressing into the fabric of her dress. The movement was subtle, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her body. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but also strangely drawn to him, as if his very presence had the power to make her both afraid and alive at the same time. The ballroom seemed to shrink around them as he leaned in just enough to ensure no one else could overhear. "You will dance with me," he stated, his voice a quiet force. There was no room for refusal in his words, no space for doubt. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had never danced with someone of his stature, someone who held so much power. She had never been allowed to partake in the luxuries of the elite. Yet here she was, standing at the precipice of everything she had been denied. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The Duke's expression softened, but there was no mistaking the authority in his eyes. He took a step back, his hand never leaving her back as he guided her onto the dance floor. The orchestra began to play, the music a soft backdrop to the tension that hung between them. Isabella's steps were shaky at first, unsure of herself, but the Duke's firm presence kept her grounded. He led, she followed. The steps were simple, but the intensity of the moment made each one feel like an eternity. The entire ballroom seemed to fade as she and the Duke moved in perfect sync. She could feel the weight of his hand on her back, the pressure of his touch, as if he was reminding her of her place beside him. There was no mistaking that he was in control. Isabella's breath became shallow as they spun in a slow circle, her eyes never leaving his. His gaze was unwavering, intense, like a storm on the horizon. She had always thought of the Duke as untouchable, unreachable, a figure that belonged to another world. But now, standing so close to him, she felt the pull of his power in a way she never had before. The tension between them was palpable, thick with unspoken words, with a power dynamic that shifted with every movement. As they continued to dance, the distance between them seemed to close, the air around them crackling with an electric charge. The room seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them at the center of everything. Isabella could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she couldn't tear her gaze away from the Duke. He had chosen her, and now she was living in the consequences of that choice. She was no longer invisible, no longer a shadow in the corner. She was dancing with the Duke, and the weight of that reality was heavy, suffocating. The Duke's hand shifted slightly, his fingers brushing against her skin through the fabric of her gown. The touch was light, almost teasing, but it sent a shiver down her spine. She had no idea what was happening between them, what kind of game he was playing, but she knew one thing. She was powerless to stop it. As the music swelled, the Duke pulled her closer, his body almost pressing against hers. The heat of his touch, the strength in his grip, made her heart race. She felt trapped in the web of his presence, a presence that demanded everything from her and gave nothing in return. But she couldn't look away. She couldn't stop herself from leaning into him, from responding to the power he exuded. The moment stretched, the music fading into the background as she and the Duke danced in a world of their own. The tension between them grew, escalating with every beat of the music, every step they took together. Isabella was no longer just a spectator in her own life. She was part of something much larger than herself, a world where power was the currency and the Duke held the keys. The dance was far from over, and neither was the tension between them. Isabella had been chosen, and now she had to face the consequences of that choice. But for now, as they moved together across the ballroom, all she could do was hold on and hope that she could keep up. The music swirled around them, but Isabella could barely hear it. Her breath was shallow, her pulse quickening with every step she took, still in the Duke's commanding grasp. He led her across the ballroom, the floor cold beneath their feet, but the heat between them was undeniable. She had never felt so exposed, yet, at the same time, so seen. The Duke's presence, the very way he moved, made it impossible for her to ignore the power dynamic that now defined everything around her. The crowd parted like water for them, but no one dared speak. No one dared to make a sound. They were witnessing the moment when a shadow became someone who could not be ignored. The Duke's hand on her back was firm, a constant reminder of where she stood in relation to him. She had been chosen, but now, as they danced, she realized there was much more to this moment than simply being chosen. She was becoming part of his world, and with that came consequences she had yet to fully understand. As they moved across the room, her eyes scanned the faces of those around them. She saw the disapproval in the eyes of some, the envy in others. The women who had once looked at her with indifference now glanced at her with disdain. And the men? They couldn't seem to look away. Every eye in the ballroom was on her, and for the first time, Isabella felt the weight of their judgment. She was no longer the unnoticed one. The Duke's hand tightened around her waist, pulling her closer, and Isabella felt the shift in the air. There was no longer just tension between them. It was palpable, raw. She could feel the power he wielded, could feel the way he controlled every moment. But what frightened her most was the realization that she could not escape it. The Duke was always in control, always the one who dictated the terms. The other women, the ones who had once been the stars of every ball, were now mere shadows to the Duke's presence. But Isabella wasn't just a shadow anymore. The silence in the ballroom deepened as the music shifted, rising into something more dramatic, more intense. The room seemed to constrict around them, as if everything in that space had been made for this moment. The Duke's eyes never left hers, and in his gaze, Isabella saw something she hadn't expected, something she didn't know how to interpret. Desire? Power? Or something darker? She couldn't tell. All she knew was that she couldn't look away. Then, as they turned, her hand brushed his chest. The briefest touch, but it was enough to send a shock through her body. His gaze flicked down to her hand, and she felt the heat of his stare like a brand. She could feel the world holding its breath, waiting for her next move, waiting for her to falter. But Isabella didn't falter. She couldn't. Not now. The power shift between them was undeniable, and it was escalating with every passing second. Her body moved in time with his, the tension between them growing with every step they took. She was no longer just the girl he had chosen. She was something more now. She was part of his world. She was a part of the Duke's world, a world where power ruled and weakness was not tolerated. The music crescendoed, and with it, the tension between them reached its peak. The Duke's hand tightened on her waist once more, and this time, he pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. She could feel his breath on her skin, and for a moment, everything in the ballroom ceased to exist except for the two of them. There was no escaping the force of his presence. There was no escaping the feeling that she was caught in something much larger than herself. As the music reached its climax, the Duke's lips barely brushed her ear. "You belong to me now," he whispered. His words were low, but they carried through the silence like a command. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, and she knew, without a doubt, that everything had changed. The ballroom around them had disappeared. There was no longer any pretension, no longer any effort to fit in with the crowd. She was no longer the girl who had lived in the shadows. She was the one who stood beside the Duke. The one he had chosen. The one he had claimed. The shift in power was unmistakable. It was in the way he held her, in the way the crowd responded to them, in the way he controlled every move she made. She was no longer part of the invisible world she had always known. Now, she was part of his world, where power was everything and nothing else mattered. The room was still. It was as if the air itself had frozen. And in that stillness, Isabella realized something else. She had no idea what to expect next. But she knew one thing for sure. Her life would never be the same. And as they continued to dance, her thoughts raced. The Duke had chosen her. But now, she would have to face whatever came next. Whatever the Duke wanted, whatever his plans were, Isabella would be right there beside him. And she would have no choice but to obey. The music swirled around them, but all Isabella could hear was the sound of her own heart pounding in her chest. Duke Ashford's hand rested on her back, steady and unyielding, as they danced across the floor. His presence was like a storm, commanding, undeniable, and she couldn't escape the force of it. She could feel the eyes of the room on them, and with each step they took, the pressure mounted. There was no mistaking the shift in the air. She had never been the center of attention before, and now, here she was, a spectacle for the entire ballroom. Every eye was on her, and every whisper seemed to carry a weight. The women looked at her with disdain, the men with curiosity, but none of them knew the truth that she was the one Duke Ashford had chosen. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. Isabella could feel the change in the dynamic between them. He had been kind to her, yes, but there was no mistaking the authority in his every movement, the power that he commanded without uttering a single word. She was in his world now, but did she belong here? The ballroom seemed to stretch on forever as they continued to dance, the movement slow, deliberate. The Duke's gaze never left hers. He held her close, the heat of his body pressing against hers, and for a moment, Isabella could feel her pulse racing beneath the weight of his touch. She was trapped, caught in the pull of his power, and there was no escaping it. Every time she looked into his eyes, she saw the man who could destroy her with a single word, the man who could make her feel small and insignificant or larger than life. It was a terrifying power to wield, and yet, it was one that she was becoming addicted to. As they turned in time with the music, the pressure of his touch grew. His hand slid down her back, just slightly, sending a jolt of electricity through her spine. The movement was subtle, but it was enough to remind her of who was in control. She wasn't sure when it happened, but suddenly, she wasn't just following him. She was reacting to him, her body responding to the unspoken command in his touch. The music shifted, rising in intensity, and the room seemed to constrict around them. It was as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. The Duke's grip tightened slightly, and for the first time, Isabella realized just how much power he truly held over her. The realization hit her like a wave. She had been chosen, yes, but now she understood what that meant. She was not simply a lady in his court. She was a piece in his game. She was the woman he had picked, and now, everything was changing. His eyes never wavered from hers, and as the music reached its crescendo, he moved closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper, but with a force that made her blood run cold. Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. She could feel the shift, the way the power had changed hands. She was no longer the invisible woman on the edge of the ballroom. She was now a part of his world, a world where power was the currency, and she had just become his most prized possession. His hand moved to her waist, pulling her closer, their bodies pressed together, and she could feel the intensity of his gaze. She wanted to look away, to escape, but she couldn't. His eyes were like a magnet, pulling her in, holding her captive. "Do you feel the weight of this?" he murmured. "The weight of being seen? Of being chosen?" Isabella's throat tightened, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. His words, his presence, were too much. The entire room seemed to vanish as he stepped even closer, his face inches from hers. The world outside of them no longer existed. It was just him and her. And in that moment, the power shifted once more. The Duke, in his infinite confidence, had brought her into his world, and now she was part of it. She was no longer a passive player. She was an active participant, and that realization terrified her more than anything else. The music swelled, and the Duke led her across the ballroom, his grip unyielding, his presence impossible to ignore. They moved as one, a perfect duet in a world that was far from perfect. The eyes of the room followed them, but none dared to speak. The whispers grew louder, but they were drowned out by the pounding of her own heart. Isabella was trapped in this moment, caught between fear and exhilaration, between power and submission. She had been chosen. But what did that really mean? As the song came to an end, the Duke did not release her. Instead, he brought her to a stop, the room still spinning around them, and the tension between them reached its peak. "You are mine," he said, his voice low and final. His words weren't a question, they were a statement, a command. And Isabella, for all her fear, for all her uncertainty, found herself unable to argue. She was his. And with that realization, the weight of her choice settled over her like a heavy cloak. There was no turning back now. The room felt like it was closing in on Isabella, her breath shallow as Duke Ashford's presence consumed every inch of the space around them. He stood before her, his eyes cold, calculating, yet there was something in them, something that demanded her attention, something that kept her locked in place. The tension between them had reached a boiling point, and neither of them made a move to break it. She could feel the weight of his gaze, like a physical force pressing down on her. She had been chosen, yes, but in that moment, it felt as though she had no choice but to play the game he set before her. "You belong here." The Duke's voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Isabella's heart skipped a beat, her thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and uncertainty. She had always known her place in society, always understood the rules. She was the daughter of a fallen house, insignificant in the eyes of the elite. But now, standing before the Duke, those rules seemed to have crumbled. She wasn't just part of the crowd anymore. She was at the center of his world. And as much as she longed to understand what that meant, a part of her was terrified by the reality of it. The crowd around them seemed to melt away as the Duke took a step closer, his hand sliding gently onto her waist. His touch was firm, but there was something oddly tender about it, as though he was claiming her in a way that went beyond mere possession. Isabella's body responded involuntarily, a shiver running down her spine at the strength of his presence. "You think you're out of your depth, don't you?" His words were barely a whisper, but they struck her like a lightning bolt. He saw right through her. She wanted to look away, but his gaze held her captive. She had always been the invisible one, the one overlooked and ignored. But with him, it was different. She was no longer a shadow in the background. She was a part of something larger, something that she wasn't sure she was ready for. Isabella's voice faltered, caught in the weight of his words. "You have no idea what you've just walked into," the Duke continued, his voice growing quieter, yet more commanding. "But you will. And when you do, you'll understand that you belong with me, whether you like it or not." His words sent a jolt through her. She had been told her whole life that she would never be enough, that she would always be a mere pawn in someone else's game. But here he was, telling her that she had value, that she had a place by his side. The room around them seemed to blur as the Duke's grip on her waist tightened slightly, pulling her in closer. She could feel the heat of his body, the sheer force of his presence, and it made her dizzy. The music in the ballroom continued to play, but to Isabella, it felt like it had become a distant hum, lost beneath the weight of what was happening between them. "This is where you belong," the Duke said again, his voice low, steady. There was no doubt in his tone, no question. His words were as much a statement as a command, and Isabella found herself unable to speak, unable to argue. She had been chosen, and the weight of that choice settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had never felt more exposed, more vulnerable, yet there was something in the Duke's presence that made her feel alive in a way she had never known. The crowd around them, once so full of whispers and curiosity, had fallen silent. No one dared speak as the Duke and Isabella stood at the center of the room, their bodies so close, the tension between them palpable. She could feel every inch of him, every breath he took, as if they were the only two people in the world. And as the seconds ticked by, the power dynamic between them shifted once again. It was no longer just a matter of him choosing her. It was about her realizing just how much he held control over her, over everything. He stepped closer, his lips nearly brushing her ear. "I'll make sure you understand," he whispered. The words sent a shiver down her spine, and Isabella realized that she wasn't just part of the Duke's world. She was at the mercy of it. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know how far he would push her, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't escape him. The power he held over her was too great. The music swelled, and the Duke's hand slid down her back, the touch sending a surge of heat through her body. She should have been afraid. She should have been running for the door, escaping the grip he had on her life. But she wasn't. She stood there, frozen, her heart racing, as the Duke pulled her deeper into his world, deeper into the chaos that was just beginning. Isabella's mind was spinning as she realized the truth. There was no turning back now. She was in his world, and she had no idea what would happen next. But one thing was certain, her life would never be the same again. The tension in the ballroom was unbearable. Duke Ashford stood before Isabella, his gaze unwavering, as the weight of his presence enveloped her. His hand rested lightly on her arm, a subtle but firm reminder of who held the power between them. The room around them had fallen silent, but Isabella could feel the eyes of the guests on her, the whispers and glances that danced through the air like invisible threads. They had been waiting for this moment, and now it had arrived. She could feel the shift in the power dynamic, a shift that was impossible to ignore. It was no longer just the Duke's choice. It was about what he expected from her. Isabella had been thrust into this world, his world, a world where power was currency, and she was now a part of the game. She had been the overlooked one, the one who stood in the shadows of her family's disgrace. But now, standing at the center of the ballroom, she felt something stir within her. She was seen. The Duke's hand on her arm tightened slightly, pulling her closer. She instinctively took a step back, but his grip did not waver. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left her face, and for a moment, the air between them was thick with unspoken words. The crowd around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the tension. Isabella's heart raced. She could feel the weight of their gazes on her, and she hated it. She hated being the center of attention, the subject of their scrutiny. But more than that, she hated the way the Duke made her feel, caught between fear and a strange, unsettling sense of belonging. She had never wanted to be a part of this world. She had never asked for the power, the prestige, the expectations. But now, as the Duke's hand gently but firmly guided her across the ballroom, she realized that she had no choice. The Duke had chosen her, and in doing so, he had pulled her into a world where nothing was ever simple. Do you feel it? The Duke's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried across the room with ease. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She could feel it, too. The pressure of the moment, the power in his touch, the unspoken promise of what would come next. His hand on her back pushed her forward, guiding her with unyielding certainty. She was his, and in that moment, she realized just how much she had already surrendered to him. The ballroom was a blur around them, the sounds of laughter and conversation fading into a distant hum. Isabella's world had narrowed down to this single moment, this single interaction. The Duke's presence was all-consuming, his power undeniable, and she was trapped in it. "You belong to me now." The Duke's words sent a jolt through her, like a sharp breath that caught in her lungs. He said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Isabella couldn't find her voice. She wanted to argue, to say something, anything, to push back against the feeling that was rising within her. But she couldn't. She had no words. His grip tightened around her waist, pulling her closer, and she could feel the heat of his body against hers. The contact sent a shiver down her spine, a reminder of just how close they were, physically, emotionally, and politically. She was a part of his world now, whether she liked it or not. The music swelled, the notes filling the air like an orchestra building to a crescendo. Every movement they made was in sync with the rhythm, each step a perfect alignment between them. Isabella's mind raced, but her body moved with him, her instincts guiding her as she followed his lead. She had never danced like this before, never been so close to anyone, let alone a man of the Duke's stature. And yet, there she was, in his arms, moving together as one. "You were always meant for this," the Duke whispered again, his words low but carrying weight, as if they were a truth that had been written into her fate long ago. Isabella couldn't find the words to respond. She didn't want to. There was no place for her to argue, no space for her to question. She had been swept up in this world, in this game, and there was no turning back now. The crowd around them continued to watch, but Isabella's focus remained solely on the Duke. His presence, his touch, was overwhelming. He was the storm in her world, and she was powerless to escape it. As they continued to dance, the tension between them grew, the space between them shrinking with every step. Isabella felt the shift in the air as the Duke's hand moved lower, settling on the small of her back. The contact was not gentle, it was firm, assertive, a constant reminder of his control. The power dynamic between them was clear. She was his, and the realization sent a surge of emotions through her. Fear, anger, confusion, but also something else. Something she couldn't name. She was caught in the storm of his presence, and she didn't know how to escape. The music reached its climax, and for a moment, everything froze. The ballroom seemed to blur, the world outside of them fading into nothingness. It was just the Duke and Isabella, caught in the stillness of the moment, their bodies moving in perfect harmony. But the power between them remained, unspoken, undeniable. Isabella knew that she had no control in this moment. She was a part of his world now, a pawn in his game, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The ballroom had become a suffocating space, a battlefield where every step Isabella took felt like a concession, every breath a silent submission. The Duke's presence pressed in on her from every side, a weight she could no longer escape. His grip on her waist was unyielding, his touch a constant reminder of the control he wielded over her, over everything in this room. The air was thick with tension, the kind that crackled between them like an electric charge. As they danced, Isabella's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, each gaze heavy with judgment, curiosity, and something darker. She had never been the center of attention before. She had always been the one overlooked, the one standing in the shadows of society's expectations. But now, here she was, caught in the eye of the storm, with no way out. The Duke led her with precision, his every movement calculated, every step a reminder of the power he held. She followed him, her body responding to his, even though her mind screamed for her to break free, to resist, to question everything. But she couldn't. She couldn't move. She couldn't speak. His control was absolute. "You look uncomfortable." The Duke's voice was low, but it cut through the tension like a blade. Isabella's breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't expected him to speak, not with so many eyes on them. But he had. His words were like a challenge, an unspoken demand for her to acknowledge the truth of their situation. She couldn't meet his gaze. She didn't know how to answer. "Do you not like the attention?" he continued, his voice smooth, almost teasing, as if he were enjoying the discomfort he was causing. Isabella's throat tightened. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, a flush of embarrassment and shame flooding her body. The eyes of the room were like 1,000 needles, pricking at her skin, making her want to shrink back, to disappear. But the Duke didn't give her the chance. His hand on her back pressed a little harder, urging her forward. He was taking the lead, as he always did, and she had no choice but to follow. The music seemed to slow down, the notes stretching into an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. Isabella could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, each thud a reminder of how out of control she felt. The Duke's presence was overwhelming, his power a tangible thing that filled the space between them, and she was suffocating under it. "You were never meant to be in this world." The Duke's words were soft, but they were like a whip cracking through the tension. "You were never meant to be seen." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. He was right, of course. She had always been the invisible one, the one who existed only in the shadows of others. But now, he had pulled her into the light, and it terrified her. She had never asked for this. She had never wanted to be a part of his world. She was a daughter of a ruined family, a nobody, and now she was at the center of everything. The Duke's grip tightened around her, and she felt his power in every inch of her body. She could feel the heat of his body against hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing. He was a force she couldn't escape. But now, "You are here," the Duke said, his voice low and final, "and you will learn your place." Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The words sent a chill down her spine. She had always known she was nothing, that she didn't belong in the world of the powerful and the privileged. But now, As she stood before the Duke, she realized how much her life had changed, how much power he had over her. The music reached its peak, the notes swelling in intensity, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The Duke led her through the final steps of the dance, his every movement commanding her attention, pulling her closer to him, until their bodies were pressed so close she could feel the heat of his skin through the fabric of their clothes. She could feel the power radiating off of him, like a furnace burning just inches from her, and yet she could not pull away. She had no choice but to stay. The world around them blurred, and in that moment, it felt as if they were the only two people in existence. The tension between them was thick, palpable, like a living, breathing thing. Isabella's mind raced, but she couldn't escape the pull of his presence. She couldn't escape the power he had over her. The music faded into the background, and all that was left was the Duke and her, locked in a dance that had no end. As they spun across the ballroom, Isabella felt herself losing control, losing herself in the storm that was the Duke's world. She had no idea where this was all leading, but she knew one thing for certain. She was at the mercy of the Duke, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The crowd around them seemed to fade, their whispers becoming muffled, as if they, too, were caught in the gravity of the Duke's presence. And in the center of it all, Isabella felt something shift. The power had shifted. She was no longer a passive participant in her own life. She had been pulled into his world, and now there was no escape. The air in the ballroom was thick with anticipation, every eye trained on Isabella and Duke Ashford as they continued to move together, a perfect image of control and grace. Yet beneath the surface, Isabella could feel the tension between them escalate, each step of the dance pushing her closer to a breaking point she could not avoid. The Duke's grip on her waist was unyielding, and with every movement, his power over her became more apparent. The ballroom seemed to close in around them, the music now a background hum, barely noticeable as the Duke led her through the steps with unrelenting authority. He was a force of nature, cold, calculated, and commanding, and she was merely a part of the spectacle he had created. His presence consumed her, leaving her no room to breathe, no space to think. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, never left her, and with every glance, she felt herself shrinking under the weight of his gaze. "Do you feel it?" The Duke's voice was low, like the sound of a distant storm, but it carried an edge that made Isabella's heart race. She didn't have to answer. The pressure, the suffocating weight of his control, was enough. She could feel her breath quickening as he pulled her closer, his hand on her back guiding her with a precision that left no room for resistance. The crowd around them seemed to dissolve, the whispers of the onlookers fading into a distant echo. All that mattered was the Duke and her, their bodies moving together in perfect harmony, yet beneath the surface, there was an unmistakable clash, a struggle for power that neither of them could deny. Isabella's pulse quickened as she realized what was happening. The Duke wasn't just guiding her in this dance. He was pushing her, testing her, trying to see how far she would go, how far she would bend before she broke. She had always been the one in the shadows, the one left behind, but now, standing in the center of the ballroom, she realized how much had changed. She was no longer invisible. The Duke had chosen her, but now, as they danced, she was becoming something else, something he wanted to control, something he wanted to own. The pressure between them intensified, and Isabella's body responded to the rhythm, almost instinctively. The dance was no longer a mere formality. It was a battle, an unspoken war over control. Her movements were sharp, forced, and the Duke seemed to sense it. His grip tightened once more, his fingers pressing into her back with such intensity that she gasped. It was a command, a demand for her to obey, to fall in line with his will. The tension between them was so thick now that it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Every eye was on them, watching, waiting to see what would happen next. "You can't run from this." The Duke's voice was low, but it was laced with authority. Isabella felt the weight of his words, and for the first time, she realized how trapped she truly was. She was no longer the girl who could slip into the shadows and fade away. She was in the spotlight now, and the Duke was making sure she knew it. She tried to pull back, tried to escape his hold, but his hand on her back moved like steel, pushing her forward, urging her to keep moving with him. The music swelled, the notes growing louder, and the tempo quickened, mirroring the rapid beating of Isabella's heart. She could feel the room shifting, the energy changing as they moved together. The power had shifted again, but this time, it was different. She wasn't just being led. She was part of the dance, part of the game. The Duke's face was inches from hers now, his breath warm against her skin as they moved in perfect synchrony. His eyes never left hers, the intensity in his gaze burning with an almost predatory focus. "You are mine," he whispered, his words a soft command that echoed through the silence between them. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She had known this was coming, had known from the moment he had chosen her that she would be his. But hearing him say it, hearing him claim her like that, sent a shock through her. She wasn't sure how to respond. There was no place for resistance in this world. There was only the Duke's will, and she was bound to it. The room seemed to blur around them as the Duke pulled her even closer, his body pressed against hers with an intimacy that sent her pulse spiraling. Isabella felt the shift in the power dynamic between them. She was no longer just the girl who had been chosen. She was part of something much larger, and the realization hit her with the force of a tidal wave. The tension between them was no longer just about their roles in this dance. It was about the future. It was about what came next. The Duke had claimed her, but what did that truly mean? As they danced, the world around them seemed to disappear. All that mattered was the space between their bodies, the weight of his hand on her back, and the feeling that she was no longer in control of her own fate. Every movement they made together felt like a declaration, an assertion of power. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just a pawn in the game. She was a part of the Duke's world, and that meant everything was about to change. The music reached its climax, the final notes hanging in the air like a drawn-out breath. The Duke held her in place, his body so close to hers that she could feel the heat radiating from him. And as the music stopped, so did everything else. The tension was at its peak, the power shift complete. The Duke's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, Isabella knew there was no going back. She was his now, completely and irrevocably. The room around them faded into silence, and the world felt as if it had stopped moving. The Duke had claimed his prize, and nothing would ever be the same again. The tension between Isabella and Duke Ashford had reached a breaking point, a pressure that neither could ignore. As they stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by the whispers of society's elite, the unspoken conflict between them seemed to grow with every passing moment. Isabella could feel the weight of the Duke's hand on her back, the warmth of his presence both comforting and suffocating. His eyes, cold and calculating, never left hers, as if waiting for something to break. And then, it happened. In a moment that seemed to stretch on forever, the Duke's grip on her tightened, his fingers pressing into her skin with such force that it almost hurt. The music faded, the room around them slowing, until there was nothing but the two of them, locked in this moment of absolute power and control. Isabella's heart raced, and for the first time, she felt something shift within her. It wasn't fear, it was something else, something far more dangerous. The Duke's hand on her back moved upward, grazing the line of her spine as he drew her even closer, his lips brushing against her ear. "You are mine," he whispered, his voice dark and commanding. Isabella's body tensed at the words, her mind racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. She had always known the Duke held power over her. After all, he had chosen her, claimed her. But in that moment, she realized something she hadn't fully understood before. The power wasn't just his. It was hers too. The realization hit her like a thunderclap, shattering the tension in the air. She wasn't a passive player in this game anymore. She had been molded by the Duke's control, yes, but she had also been shaping herself in his image, learning his moves, adapting to his world. And now, she understood. The power dynamic between them wasn't as clear-cut as she had once thought. She wasn't just a pawn in his hands. She had a role to play, one she could control. She could push back. Slowly, deliberately, she took a step back, breaking the connection between them, pulling away from his touch. The Duke's eyes narrowed, a flash of something darker crossing his features. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The room fell silent. The orchestra's music halted in midair. "You think you can defy me?" His voice was like ice, cutting through the stillness with an edge of danger. Isabella swallowed hard, But she didn't back down. She looked him in the eye, her gaze steady. "I'm not here to be owned," she said, her voice quieter than she intended, but it carried the weight of a truth she had only just realized. The Duke's jaw clenched, and for a brief moment, Isabella saw something flicker in his eyes, a crack in the facade, a brief glimpse of vulnerability. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by a cold mask of indifference. "You belong to me," he repeated, his words a command, but there was something in his voice now, a hesitation, a flicker of doubt. Isabella took another step back, the air between them growing thicker with each passing second. "I belong to myself," she said, more firmly this time. The Duke's hand reached for her once more, but this time, Isabella wasn't going to be controlled. She stepped aside, avoiding his touch, her heart pounding in her chest. The power had shifted. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her. The crowd around them had started to murmur, their whispers rising in intensity as the tension between Isabella and the Duke escalated. The weight of the room's expectations pressed down on her, but she refused to let them break her. She was done being the passive player in this game. She had been chosen, yes, but she wasn't going to be anyone's puppet. Not anymore. The Duke stared at her, his eyes hardening, his posture stiffening. The moment had shifted. No longer was he the one who controlled the dance. No longer was he the one who dictated her fate. Isabella had taken control, and for the first time, she felt the power of that decision. The Duke's expression darkened, but he didn't move toward her again. Instead, he stood there, a shadow of the man who had once seemed untouchable. And in that silence, as the room held its breath, Isabella realized the truth. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She wasn't a pawn in the Duke's game. She had her own power, and she was finally ready to claim it. The moment hung in the air, suspended in time, like a single, frozen breath before everything came crashing down. The Duke had thought he could control her, thought he could claim her as his own. But Isabella was no longer the girl who stood in the shadows, invisible to the world. She was a woman who had found her voice, and in that voice, she had found her strength. As the music swelled back to life and the guests resumed their whispered conversations, Isabella stood tall, her gaze never leaving the Duke's. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. The power had shifted, and this time, it was hers. The moment the truth was revealed, everything shifted. Isabella stood in the center of the ballroom, the weight of what had just been said hanging between her and Duke Ashford like a thick fog. The world around her seemed to blur, the whispers of the guests fading into a distant hum as she tried to process the revelation. The Duke had claimed her. Yes, but there was more to it. He wasn't just a man who had chosen her. He was a man who had manipulated the circumstances of her life, a man who had set the stage for everything that had happened to her. The realization hit her with the force of a thunderclap. He hadn't just seen her as a prize to claim. He had carefully crafted the narrative, leading her to this moment. She was part of his game, his plan, and the truth was now undeniable. Isabella felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the sting of betrayal cutting deeper than she had ever imagined. For all the power, the prestige, the grandeur he had given her, it was nothing but a facade. She wasn't here by choice. She was here because he had made sure she would be. And that thought, that truth, burned through her, igniting something she hadn't known existed within her, defiance. The Duke stood before her, his gaze cold, his posture unyielding, as though he expected her to accept the truth without question. But Isabella couldn't. She couldn't accept this lie that had been woven so intricately around her, this world where she had never been given a choice, only the illusion of one. His eyes never left hers, calculating, measuring, waiting for her reaction. But this time, there was no hesitation in her, no fear. She had heard him, seen him for what he truly was, and the power he once held over her had evaporated. In the space between them, the tension was palpable, thick like smoke, swirling around them. "You think I'm yours?" Isabella's voice was low, but it carried the weight of her realization, the force of her newfound strength. The Duke's brow furrowed, confusion flashing across his features for the briefest moment. "You belong to me, Isabella," he said, his voice cold, commanding. But there was no longer any conviction in his words. No authority. The moment had slipped away from him, and he knew it. Isabella took a step forward, her gaze never leaving his. "No," she said, the single word sharp and final. "I'm not yours. I never was." The words hung in the air between them, a challenge, a declaration of war. She wasn't sure where the courage came from, but it surged through her, steady and unwavering. She could feel it, the shift in the balance of power, the change in the atmosphere around them. The Duke had always held the upper hand, but not anymore. Not now. "You're a fool if you think I'll stand by and let you dictate my life," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger with every word. "You don't control me. You never have." The room was silent, the guests watching in stunned disbelief as Isabella confronted the Duke. She could feel their eyes on her, but this time, their judgment meant nothing. For the first time, she was no longer the fragile, helpless girl in the shadows. She was someone else now. The Duke's expression darkened, and for a moment, Isabella saw a flicker of something in his eyes, something raw, something desperate. The mask he wore, the one that had been so carefully constructed, was slipping, and the man behind it was revealed for a brief moment. It was almost a relief to see it, the cracks in his control, the vulnerability that had been buried beneath his arrogance. But Isabella didn't feel pity. She didn't feel sympathy. What she felt was anger, a burning fury at the lies, the manipulation, and the power games he had played with her life. "You think you can defy me?" The Duke's voice was low, laced with frustration. His hand moved toward her, but Isabella stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice steady, every inch of her defiance now clear in her words and her posture. The Duke's hand faltered in midair, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, Isabella thought he might strike her. But he didn't. He stood there, staring at her, and in that moment, something shifted between them. The power was no longer his to wield. The air crackled with the intensity of their unspoken confrontation, and Isabella realized something she had never known before. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his validation. She didn't need anyone's approval. The Duke was silent, the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. But Isabella was no longer afraid. She had taken back the power he had stolen from her, and she would not give it up again. The ballroom felt small now, the crowd fading into the background as she stood before him, her own strength radiating from within her. "You never had control over me," she said, her voice unwavering, her heart steady in her chest. "And you never will again." There was a long pause, a silence that stretched out, thick with the weight of their words. The Duke didn't speak, didn't move. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. And in that silence, Isabella knew. This was the moment when everything had changed. The moment when she had stopped being the girl who was controlled by the Duke, and had become the woman who controlled her own fate. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. The silence that followed their confrontation was deafening. The Duke stood motionless, his eyes locked onto Isabella, who had taken a step back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of her defiance. Every muscle in her body was taut, but there was a fire burning within her now, something she had never felt before. The power she had reclaimed was both terrifying and liberating, and it surged through her like a tide. For the first time, she felt truly alive. The guests around them had fallen silent, their whispers stilled, waiting for the next move. Isabella could feel their eyes on her, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't the invisible woman anymore. She was the one who had spoken out, the one who had stopped hiding in the shadows. The Duke's gaze softened just a fraction, but it was enough for Isabella to see that he was finally registering what had happened. The control he had wielded over her was slipping, and it unsettled him. But he wasn't done yet. His expression hardened again, the mask of authority quickly settling back into place. He stepped closer, his presence overpowering, but this time, Isabella didn't step back. Instead, she stood her ground, her eyes never leaving his. The room felt like it was holding its breath, the tension between them building to a crescendo. The Duke reached out, his hand hovering inches from her face, but this time, Isabella didn't recoil. She didn't shy away from his touch. "You've made your point," the Duke said, his voice low, but with an edge of respect she had never heard from him before. Isabella felt the shift in the air, the change in his tone. It was subtle, but it was there. For the first time, the Duke wasn't just speaking as a man of power. He was speaking as someone who had been forced to acknowledge that he could no longer control her. His hand dropped to his side, and for a moment, they simply stood there, facing each other, the weight of their history, their past, hanging between them. But it wasn't the past that mattered now. It was the present, the here and now. The world around them seemed to fade as Isabella took a deep breath, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than it had ever been. "I don't need you to define me anymore," she said, her voice firm, steady. "You don't control me." The words felt like a declaration of independence, a final severing of the ties that had bound her to his world. The Duke's eyes flickered, the faintest trace of surprise crossing his features, but there was no going back. She had said it. She had taken the power back. For the first time, Isabella felt as though she was truly standing on her own. The Duke's gaze never wavered, but there was a new understanding in his eyes, an unspoken recognition that their dynamic had irrevocably changed. "Perhaps you are right," he said, his voice quieter now, the command gone from his tone. "But I will never regret choosing you." Isabella's heart skipped a beat at his words, but she didn't let herself be swayed. "You didn't choose me," she corrected him. "You chose to control me. But that's over now." There was a brief silence, and in that silence, Isabella felt the last remnants of her fear dissipate. She was free. The Duke looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, she saw him, truly saw him. The power he had once commanded was now a shadow of what it had been. He had tried to break her, to mold her into something she wasn't, but she had resisted. She had fought back. And now, as the world around them began to slowly return to its usual rhythm, Isabella realized that the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The Duke had underestimated her. He had thought that his control over her was unshakable, but she had proven him wrong. Isabella wasn't a pawn in his game. She was the one who held the cards now. The room began to stir, the guests whispering once more, their attention shifting as they saw the change in the dynamic. But Isabella didn't care. She had won. She had taken her power back, and there was no turning back now. She wasn't the girl she had been when she first walked into this ballroom, helpless and unsure. She was someone new, stronger, more confident, and in control of her own fate. And the Duke? He might still hold power, but he had no hold over her anymore. The moment stretched, frozen in time, before Isabella turned and walked away. The Duke didn't stop her, didn't try to call her back. She didn't need him to. The ballroom was hers now, her world to command. The power had shifted, and this time, she was the one who held it. The ballroom had fallen into an uneasy silence, the weight of Isabella's departure hanging heavily in the air. The guests, once buzzing with whispers, now stood frozen, eyes darting between her and the Duke. Isabella's heart thundered in her chest, but her steps were sure. She could feel the Duke's gaze on her back, but she didn't turn to meet it. She had taken control, and she would not let herself be swayed by the lingering shadows of his power. The Duke, once the embodiment of control and dominance, now stood motionless, as if he had been struck by the force of her defiance. His eyes followed her every movement, but there was no longer the same certainty in his stare. The grip he once had on her had loosened, and in its place, there was a quiet realization that he no longer commanded her. She had changed the game. As she reached the door, her hand hovering above the handle, Isabella hesitated for just a moment. The tension in the room was suffocating, but she could feel a shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere. She turned her head, her gaze meeting the Duke's for the final time. The look they shared in that fleeting moment was unlike any they had exchanged before. It wasn't anger or frustration, nor was it pity. It was something new, something akin to respect, but laced with a sense of defeat. The Duke, a man who had once thought he could control her, now understood that she could never be owned. Isabella opened the door slowly, the sound of it creaking, like the final exhale of a long-held breath. The cool night air rushed in, brushing against her skin, and for the first time, she felt free. The weight of the ballroom, of the Duke's world, fell away as she stepped outside. The night was dark, but the stars above seemed brighter, clearer, as if they, too, recognized her newfound freedom. She didn't need the Duke's approval. She didn't need anyone's. The choice had been hers all along, and she had made it. Behind her, the door to the ballroom remained ajar, the Duke's figure still looming in the doorway, watching her every step. But this time, he didn't follow. He didn't try to pull her back into his world. And as she took another step into the cool night, the Duke's shadow faded, replaced by the light of her own path, a path she would walk alone. Isabella didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. She had taken back her power, and nothing could take that away from her. The tension that had